So let's get started.
One of our class members.
Hi, Camille. All right, Camille King.
Let's see.
And now I recognize some of the faces from Saturday, last Saturday.
Wish I'd been there.
In spirit, you were. Someone even called you enthralling on our outing.
Speaking to me?
Yes.
But you had a full house, right? You had to turn people away, no?
Yeah.
It looked like fun. I watched the video.
Isn't that a line from a movie? You talking to me?
Yeah, De Niro.
I don't think I have the same impact. Oh.
Yeah, it's Ron Mark's video when we get it going.
Are you sharing a screen, Susan?
I am.
I'm
It's
not
not
seeing,
working.
I'm not seeing anything.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Blue screen.
Okay, let me try again.
Of the upturned tail is a marker.
Is this working now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Was predicted in 1931 and again in 1954. Reeds, cordgrass, and pickleweed are its refuge. With tidal sloughs as feeding grounds, it shares with maybe more distinctive species like the long-billed curlew. Curlews are impressively adapted to reach deeply buried invertebrate prey. Once called the California clapper rail, the threatened Ridgway's rail even has a Latin name that suggests impermanence, Rallus obsoletus. The white rump patch of the upturned tail is a marker for ridgeways. And they share with related species large feet adapted to walking tidal mud. An indicator species, the Ridgway's rail depends on protection of its rich but narrowed habitat that supports so much life.
Risky corner.
Not long ago,
Okay, well, thank you, Ron Marks. That was one of our classmates there that made that video. I have never seen the Ridgway's rail, and they're hard to see, so it's nice to see such great video of it.
Can I give some advice for people who want to go looking for them?
Sure.
What I suggest is watch the tide tables and know about a marsh where they're known to live, and get out there as the tides drop, in that hour or two after, what that rail was doing was scavenging the mudflat that had been exposed by receding tides. And that's common behavior. So that's, one way that you might try to improve your chances of seeing the rail. They do show up at surprise sometimes, but that's one repeat pattern I've seen.
Good. Well, that was a nice video to start off because a lot of our focus tonight is on wildlife of the Bay. And thanks to all that joined the actual in-person tour, and thanks to Eileen and Myrna and James. And then also to about a dozen people that joined me online to watch it. Tonight the first thing we'll do is watch a webinar video on San Francisco Bay migratory and resident birds. Then we have a guest speaker that is talking about a really emerging area of study, which is the effects of light pollution on wildlife. Then we'll do breakout sessions to read our 50 to 100 word statements about what concerns we have about the Ravenswood Business District development. After that, we have another webinar video on tidal wetlands and nature-based infrastructure. And if time permits, we'll have a little bit of a group discussion, and perhaps we can take a look at those renderings again, if there's time. So I'd like to begin with a webinar video by Julian Wood of the Birds of San Francisco Bay. Okay.
And now I'm delighted to introduce Julian Wood. He's the San Francisco Bay Program Leader at Point Blue Conservation Science. Take it away, Julian.
Thank you. Thank you, James. And it's great to be here. Thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be able to present to you. I'm going to be talking about the importance of the Bay's habitats to migratory and resident birds. And I think this will follow up nicely on John and Julie's presentation. And so that's really just one of the key messages there, the importance of the Bay for birds. I also want to talk about how sea level rise threatens the Bay's biodiversity and how a nature-based adaptation to sea level rise can benefit our birds and our human communities. So first, a little bit about me. I'm the San Francisco Bay Program Leader for Point Blue Conservation Science, and I lead a variety of bird monitoring and research projects, all aimed at understanding bird population trends and status, and also habitat needs. And I take our results to improve restoration planning and management of our bay's wetlands and shoreline. So I don't want to belabor this point, but as both Julie and John have already talked about, we have lost well over 80% of our historic tidal marsh. So a marsh that looked very much like this one used to completely surround the bay. And this loss has had a really dramatic effect on bird populations, of course, that rely on this habitat. So some of these species that you see down here, this is the only place that they live. So the common yellowthroat, the song sparrow, all of these species here have endemic subspecies that exist only in tidal marsh and only in San Francisco Bay. So if we lose this marsh, we lose these populations for good. And so that's pretty serious. And Valerie is going to talk a little bit later about the Ridgway's rail, federally threatened endangered species. And we also have the black rail, which is a state threatened species. So some of the other habitats that we had, or still have in the bay, but have lost a great deal of, over 40% of the tidal flat has been lost. Now, at first glance, this might not look like particularly productive habitat, but this is really important for shorebirds. And you've probably seen huge flocks of shorebirds when you're driving along the highway and looking out over the bay or walking along the shoreline. Most of these shorebirds rely on the bay over the winter. That's when the vast majority of them are here, and they feed on the invertebrates in the mud in these tidal flats. And a couple of these species, the stilts and the outosets, are actually resident. So they stick around and they breed. And we also shouldn't forget that raptors are also depend on these tidal flats because they prey on the shorebirds. So it does support a community. So I want to talk a little bit about what we have managed to save. And I think John touched on this. Our bay community continues to support efforts to keep the bay healthy and clean, and we've invested in protection and restoration. So we've made great progress in getting back some of that habitat that we lost. And we're also smarter about managing what's left so that we can maximize the benefits to shorebirds and waterfowl. And so, yeah, in short, restoration works. We've seen this happen in multiple places throughout the bay. We're very lucky that this does work so well. It's a proven technique in the bay. And we have seen birds like this, like the endangered Ridgway's rail, come back to areas that were formerly hayfields. And this is one of those sites that has evolved into a healthy tidal marsh. So we know it works. And we've also, because of our protection efforts to date, the San Francisco Bay is a site of hemispheric importance for shorebirds. Over 1 million shorebirds pass through the San Francisco Bay each year, many of them spending the winter here, but some of them just passing through on their migration and fueling the rest of their migration and their breeding. So it's a hugely important place for shorebirds. It's also a wetland of international importance as designated by the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. And that's due in part to those shorebirds, but also the waterfowl, the ducks. Tens of thousands of ducks also use the bay, again, mostly in the winter, though some species and individuals are here year round. And there are other habitat types, too many for me to get into in this talk, but that are very important to a diverse waterbird community here in the bay. So these are just some of my favorites. Each one of these species kind of depends on a slightly different habitat type within the bay, and we're lucky to have these habitat types in the bay. And it's really this tapestry of different habitat types, this mosaic that makes the San Francisco Bay such an important place for birds. And again, there's many habitat types and many different bird species that I'm not going to get into now. So, the big question is what's going to happen to all these habitats with sea level rise. I'm going to just highlight some of them that are under the most threat. And that's of course tidal flats. As waters deepen, wave energy is going to increase and potentially begin to erode these tidal flats. Again, unless we get enough sediment, have enough sediment coming in to protect those areas. And that has huge implication for those million plus shorebirds that use the bay. Another habitat is tidal marsh, of course, that is highly susceptible to sea level rise. And as the waters increase, these birds are going to have a harder time finding cover from predators. So they're going to be really impacted. Now, I should mention, of course, that tidal marshes are dynamic, as John and Julie pointed to. They can keep pace with sea level rise, but they do need sediment in order to do that. And some of our earlier work has shown that if we are looking at higher rates of sea level rise, and if we get decreasing sediment supplies, we could lose up to 90% of these tidal marshes. So there's a good chance that these marshes will need our help and will need additional sediment to keep pace with sea level rise. Subtidal habitat, another threatened habitat, and this is important for birds like black oyster catcher that feeds on the mussels and the oyster beds, and also ducks, sea ducks that forage in eelgrass beds that could be threatened by rising sea levels. And really all of these shallow water habitats that we're talking about are highly at risk. Many of these are protected by very low earthen non-structural levees that are costly to maintain. And it's really going to be important to figure out ways to integrate these types of habitats into flood planning, flood risk reduction strategies, so that we can maintain this habitat for shorebirds and use these habitats to protect us from sea level rise and storms. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like when a tidal marsh floods and becomes inundated, this is one of the extreme events. So you can see normally this would be covered in vegetation, but there's very little vegetation left here for birds to hide in. And we can have Ridgway's rails, for example, being very exposed to predation. They don't fly very well, and so they're very, very susceptible. So that's the impacts to the wildlife, to birds, but of course also has sea level rise has big impacts for our human communities. And right now, it's most of what we have seen and experienced has been more like nuisance flooding, like roads flooding, but this is becoming increasingly serious, and people's lives are going to be at risk. So it's a real big question. How are we going to respond to this? And will we first consider solutions that benefit both birds and people? I think that's why we're all here today, to think about that very important question. And here's a photo that kind of illustrates some of these points. There's a lot going on in this picture here. In the foreground, you see some native marsh vegetation that can be used by some of those species that I mentioned, like the song sparrow and the yellowthroat. And then in the background, and that tidal marsh is helping to protect the levee that we're standing on here. And in the background, you can see that we're continuing to build right up to the edge of the shoreline. And of course, as Julian mentioned, that's not even the original shoreline, which was behind those buildings. So this area is at risk. Now, there's some hope here in this photo as well. This is a South Bay Salt Pond restoration project here. So this tidal flat is starting to accrete, and the marsh is growing and can continue to further protect these levees from erosion. So it's, the question is where can we implement these kinds of projects? We have limited dollars, and as Julie mentioned, not every solution will fit in every place. One of the things that we are doing is trying to figure out, to layer on top of that, where these restoration solutions best benefit tidal marsh birds, for example. So we use our bird data. This is an example of the 25-year data set that we have on tidal wetland birds collected from all over the bay. And we're using that information to find out what are the areas in the bay that are most important for birds, both now and potentially in the future. So just to give you one example of what that looks like, this is a prioritization map from our Future Marshes viewer that looks at areas that are important to birds. And you can see these circled areas, the darker colors are areas that are important for birds, not only now, but also in the future, especially if we are able to allow marshes to increase into those subsided areas by removing levees and allowing the tidal marshes to restore in those areas. And it's kind of behind my video feed here, but just to zoom in to Sassoon Marsh. So this is also, our modeling has shown that this area here is also really important for birds, both now and particularly in the future, This is a screenshot from the adaptation atlas that Julie presented. And these orange areas are currently uplands, but they could become tidal marsh in the future if we simply allow the water to move up onto that landscape. But they really don't have any special protection because they're just uplands. So they could be developed. And so we have to think about, you know, how is that really an appropriate use for that area? Or should we be allowing the waters to move into those areas, provide habitat, and also provide flood protection and avoid costly disasters and fixes down the road. So just to give an example of what that looks like to prepare these upland areas for marsh migration. This is our STRAW program. STRAW stands for Students and Teachers Restoring a Watershed. And they're restoring levees and also uplands with dense native vegetation to benefit birds. And we completed a study about this and looked at some of what characteristics we need to benefit birds. And we found that wider levees are actually associated with with healthier tidal marsh bird populations. So if we can, when we're thinking about levees as part of flood infrastructure, we need to be thinking about creating wide, gradually sloped levees to best benefit those tidal marsh birds when it's adjacent to that habitat. So just to kind of summarize here, we're talking about flood protection and the benefits to important bird habitat. So that's really what nature-based solutions is all about. And so I've showed you some examples of how tidal marshes can be used to buffer wave energy and also provide carbon sequestration that Patty's going to talk about in the presentation coming up. And also how wider levees can be restored with dense native vegetation to provide cover from predators or important endangered tidal marsh species, and uplands that can accommodate sea level rise, and again, buffer those areas adjacent communities to floodwaters. And also that we need to remember that these managed wetlands, especially in South Bay, should be part of flood control systems, and that they can provide benefits to a diverse community of wetland birds. So it's important to think about what birds might be benefiting from those different solutions. And thinking about that can also help get funding for those projects by including birds as part of those solutions. So in summary, hopefully I've convinced you of my key messages that the San Francisco Bay really is an important place for birds, that biodiversity is threatened by sea level rise, and that nature-based adaptation can really benefit birds and people. So thank you.
All right. Well, I'm not sure why we lost the feed there for a second, but we got it back. So there was one question that came in the chat that I wanted to throw out there, maybe for Eileen. So somebody asked what uplands are. Upland is just any of the land, the uphill land from the bay is usually referred to as uplands. But there was another question. Is there a way to tell, or is there a map that shows where bay shorelines are eroding versus where deposition is happening?
There's not one map that I know of. Because I mean, some of the scientists may not have done that. I've seen presentations by particularly USGS scientists who have been doing those kinds of studies on the bay. And they do indicate that there is a tendency toward erosion along the edge of these marshes, so that they seem to be moving back from the bay, and in multiple places, and that was always tied to discussions of available sediment, that's moved around. The shorelines that are most heavily influenced by that are more in the open bay, where there's more wave action, and that results. But
work here so you can see me. I've been the environmental advocate for Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society for a little over 10 years. I started as a volunteer and I knew nothing about advocacy. Today, I think I know a lot about advocacy. So I'm going to share a little bit about an issue that as diurnal animals, we don't usually pay attention to, but it's really, really critical for all our ecosystems, including all around the bay. So I'll be talking a little bit about light and birds again, and then get into some of the more clear details. So next slide, Dash. So this slide was taken last night. It shows, it's from Birdcast, which is from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They use radar data to show where the birds are migrating. We all know that birds migrate south generally in fall now, and then come back north during the spring to go and breed usually in north and spend the winters in the south. And what you see here is the United States map of birds last night at around 2 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. Eastern time. This was the map of densities. There were 385 million birds migrating south mostly, but you can see the arrows of where they were going. And you can see a high concentration on the East Coast and then some on the West Coast. This is just a glimpse of it because this is a map that you can actually animate and see the birds' movement, and we'll try to get to that later. What is interesting here is that looks like there are a lot more birds on the East Coast. I think generally it's true, but also on the East Coast, there's more radar towers and we only have Mount Ununum. So there may be some bias in what we can see on our radar here compared to the East Coast and other areas. And I will come back to that if we have time later. But the other thing that is really important to know is that most of the birds fly at night. So we wake up and we say, oh, these birds are here now. But the birds really, most of them fly during the night, during migration. So like I said, this was taken at 11:30 our time, 2:30 Eastern time. And the birds during the night, they migrate. During the day, they hunker down and wait. And the reasons, there are many. People think that it's to be less obvious so they won't get eaten by other species. There's also migration, and long distance flight generates a lot of heat. So it's easier to dissipate that heat and not have your body heat up during the night. Let's go to the next slide. And so where are they going in the Bay Area? You heard the previous speaker showing you how important the Bay is. These are hotspots in Santa Clara County, and all of them are along the Bay. And the birds that have been seen there, the species are between 259 or 200 in all these areas around the Bay. And the picture would be very similar in other counties where the birds are mostly, or the hotspots where most of the birds and most of the species are seen are around the Bay and along the coast. In San Mateo County, the coast is also very important, and so on. Santa Clara County doesn't have a coast other than the Bay. Okay, next. So I don't know if you can play this. This is golden crowned sparrow, and there are maps that are also produced to show you where the birds are going. And when you look, you missed it. Can you go back to the sparrow? Golden crowned sparrow is a species that is mostly resident in, it's a West Coast species on the coast. And if you play it again, you can see the months. So during the winter, it's around here. And then in spring, it migrates and breeds up in Alaska and Washington. And this is pretty cool that you can see what it's doing. We'll go to another species and see what it's doing. And that would be the ruby-crowned kinglet, this little bird. It's tiny. It's a bird that's, I'll show you later just how small it is. And this bird migrates at a much broader spectrum. They're all over the United States. And then all of a sudden they all migrate north and they breed and then they come back and migrate south. Let's go to another one, which was mentioned earlier, the long-billed curlew. That's a shorebird, and they nest in the central north United States. But during the winter, they spend the winters in the Central Valley, in the Bay, and along the peninsula here. So, you know, it's pretty cool that we have this data now, and technology has been very helpful in showing us where the birds are. And so let's go to the next one. So what are the threats that these birds encounter on their way? Loss of habitat and migration rest areas are really important. We're losing areas where they can find food, water, and shelter. Collision with man-made structures, it kills hundreds of millions of birds in North America every year. And that includes primarily buildings and glass, but also wind turbines, power lines, all sorts of things that birds bump into. Artificial light at night, which is what I'm going to talk about a little more later, is really problematic for the birds. It attracts them to areas where there are hazards, areas where they would collide with buildings, areas where they don't find food. It interferes with their navigation. There is evidence now showing that birds actually change their migration to go over areas that are lit. And it really changes the physiology and behavior, not only of the birds themselves, but also of their food and everything that's associated with biology in any organism. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Climate change, obviously. Outdoor cats are a big threat to birds, and poisoning. I think, Lori, you were trying to stop some poisoning years ago at McClellan Ranch, and I know elsewhere as well, with rodenticides. Let's go to the next slide. This is the Bay Area from Google Maps or Google Earth. I took this a couple of months ago. So you can see that at night, we are very, very bright. The arrow is around Sunnyvale, but you know, you can see the entire bay here and how bright it is at night. And let's go to the next slide. And when we think about light and we think from an animal that lives during the day, the dark is threatening, but for a lot of animals and birds and other animals, the dark is really important. So what we see is that artificial light, and note that I'm not talking yet about light pollution, I'm just talking about light. It harms all biological beings and all ecosystems. And there is a wealth of knowledge about that. In the last few years, there is so many articles and studies and conferences and UN symposia and all sorts of things showing just how important and how difficult light is for most living things. And the reason is response to light is really evolutionary. Even the first cells in the ocean respond to light by going up towards light during the day and sinking into the ocean floor or lakes at night. And because it's so embedded in our systems, there are gene expressions and hormonal systems that respond to light, and they respond both to daily changes in terms of, you know, the day is short or the day is long, but also in seasonal. So how much the day is shorter today as yesterday, and how these changes happen. So this, the seasonal changes and the daily changes in sunlight provide cues to biological functions and behaviors such as reproduction. We all know that the birds, you know, they breed in spring and seeds are produced in summer. So for both plants and animals, reproduction, foraging, migration, germination, when do you drop the leaves? When do your flowers come out? All of that in plants and both terrestrial and aquatic species respond to light. And when the light changes, when we change it by lighting up areas, we create asynchrony between, let's say, when the flowers bloom and when the bees emerge from their cocoons to pollinate those plants. We create asynchronies between when the chicks hatch in a nest and when the caterpillars are available to feed them. We create deep sea asynchrony in our entire food web and our ecosystems. There's also issues of fatal attraction, I call it, of birds, insects, fish, turtles, and other species that are attracted to light, and thereby when there's an artificial light at night, it brings them to the wrong place at the right time, but to the wrong place. And we see turtles that are attracted, instead of going towards the moonlight in the ocean, they'll go onto a roadway with lights, or birds that are bumping into, and I'll show you a few of those. And the last thing I will maybe speak about a little bit later is that the hormonal disruptions that is associated with light triggers disease and mental health issues in people. And not only indoors, even outdoors. And that is pretty surprising, maybe, but it is what it is. Next. This is can you play the video on mute? No sound. So this is a video of 9/11 Memorial, Tribute in Light. The Tribute in Light only is active one night a year on 9/11, and it attracts a lot of animals like birds and insects that get trapped in the light, and they can't really fly out of it. They're attracted to it, and every time they try to get away, they turn around and come back. So there was a study that was done in 2015, one night. They didn't have the lights on. They had 500 birds, and that's on the screen, within half a kilometer. Then they turned on the lights and beams, and within 20 minutes, they had 15,000 birds. So you can see what this does. And unless the lights are turned off, those birds or bugs will not find their way out. So they have volunteers that when they see a lot of these white dots, they turn off the light for a little while. Next. So science now is showing that the insect apocalypse, which I'm not sure you heard much about this, but we're losing our insects populations worldwide. And that is attributed to a large extent to lighting at night. So there was an article just last week, I think, about in England how street light has detrimental impacts to insect populations. The other study that I have on this picture is, can scientists help insects survive fatal attraction to light at night? We're essentially eliminating insects, but many other species, and many of them we don't even know. Go ahead. So back to bird collisions with glass. This is a ruby-crowned kinglet. I told you I'll show you how small it is. This is one that I collected in Sunnyvale. When birds are active near structures, there is collisions always with glass. Birds are attracted to light, and so that the lighting and glass are creating a pretty deadly combination for birds. We'll go to the next slide. So many cities, so far mostly in the East Coast and North, are looking at lights out plans. Basically ask building owners and business owners and residences to turn the light off during migration. And now that we know where the birds are with Birdcast, you can tell them, okay, tomorrow between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., please turn all the lights off. Next, there's another one. This is in Chicago, lights out alert issued for Chicago. And this is just now. These are like really recent articles because millions of birds will be on the move this weekend. Next. So how did we get to where we can't see the Milky Way anymore? light in a way, it's kind of like sugar. It's really bad for us, but we crave it. We really like light. People like light. It makes them feel safer. It's festive. It's used for celebrations, and people really do like light, just like we like sugar. I thought I would try to distinguish between artificial light at night, which is also called ALAN, A-L-A-N, which is all light, and light pollution, which essentially is what escapes or is not wanted, not intended. The problem is that these days, after we all transition to LED, because it saves energy per fixture, and it saves energy, and it's easier to maintain. So overall, there's a lot of savings. The drawback of that is that we're using a lot more light. People use more fixtures. Because it's cheaper and easier, they light up their gardens, they light up their walls. They just create a lot more lighting than they used to be. And also, and this is a little bit less obvious, but the LEDs, at the beginning, they have very high, what is called correlated color temperature, which you can think about is the spectrum of the light, how much blue or white light there is, how white the light is, how cold it is versus the more yellowish, warmer wavelengths. And the blue component of light is the component that interacts more harmfully with biological systems. So let's try go to the next one. So here is two lights in Mountain View right next to the other, one with the very cold white light and one with the warmer yellowish light. And the colder lights are a lot more harmful to wildlife and to people. These lights are both bad because they're not shielded. And and generally the recommendation is to shield lights so there's no light escaping towards the sky, and try to protect the sky. But we also need to protect the things that are under the shield and are exposed to the light, and that can include people. So let's go to the next slide. So that's where the International Dark Sky Association, they estimate that at least 30% of outdoor lighting in the United States is wasted, mostly because lights are not shielded. And they said, and this is a few years old, and since then a lot more lighting has been added. But they said it adds to $3.3 billion and the release of 21 million tons of carbon dioxide per year, lighting up things that we don't have to light up. And so you can see that they would say that you need to only light up what you need to light up with only as much light as you need, only during the time that you need it lit, etc. So really minimize how much light is generated. And also you can see here, kind of nice to see the stars every now and then, and we in urban areas don't see it anymore. Next. So what that does, I thought I'll put a couple of articles from Frontiers in Neuroscience and from Nature, Ecology and Evolution. These are respectable scientific articles showing that the artificial light at night has really pervasive and harmful impacts to flora, fauna, and ecosystems. And I spoke about that a little bit before and to why. And we can go to the next one, and I'll talk a little bit about humans. So here is a light that is not shielded. Campus in Cupertino. So what we see is that artificial light at night causes sleep disorders. I was surprised at first when Dash started doing the research and found out that light outside causes breast cancer or contributes to it, and then found a lot more about thyroid and prostate cancer, obesity, diabetes, affective mood disorders and depression and anxiety, premature births, children growth, really wide spectrum of anything that responds to gene expression and to hormonal functioning in our bodies. Next. So this is an article from last year, June of last year, outdoor light link with teen sleep and mental health. The reason I thought I'll bring a few of these is that we know that indoor lighting, like what I have shining on me right now, is problematic, but outdoor people thought, oh, that's not a big deal. And turns out that there's just a few studies, and the way they do these studies, they look through epidemiological studies combined with satellite pictures of lighting. So this is one of them. Next. There are some that show that living near street lamps could increase risk of thyroid cancer, premature birth. Next. Some more about breast cancer. Next. And even light pollution makes mosquitoes that carry the West Nile. This is Aedes aegypti. That's the mosquito that carries the West Nile virus, and they apparently are more active and bite more when there is light around. Next. And I was thinking, Dash, can you show this? Because I really like this. And I thought, I'll end with showing you this again and how the birds are migrating. So if you can show the video, it's pretty cool. And what you can see in this video that I kind of explained before, but you can see the darkness. The red light is darkness. And you can see how after dark the birds start. Then with all conquer. There are questions, but I think that's kind of covers what I wanted to show.
Great, Shani, thank you very much. Are there any questions for Shani?
Question.
Gita has a question. Go ahead, Gita.
Shani, you said that now it's fall and it's the migrating. Is this a good time for us to go down to the bay and see migrating birds? And if so, where would be good places to go? I tried looking in Audubon and they don't have anything.
The hotspots that I had at the beginning, so you can look at eBird, and Dash, can you put the eBird link? So there are areas that are considered hotspots, and you can check for each county and see where the hotspots for birds are. They're just arriving now. So to see them in migration, they're at night, like I said, they migrate at night, but you can see them when they arrive. So most of the birds that come to the bay stay here throughout the winter. A lot of birds just fly through, and those are really not very easy to find. And you have to go to one of the hotspots and probably with an expert birder to see them. Ulistock is a good place to see a lot of migrants. Sunnyvale Baylands Park is a good place to see those ephemeral things that just come and go. To see the birds that stay here for the winter, you can wait a little. You don't have to go right now. They're arriving. They're coming.
Will you let us know?
People always record first of season. So the first of season ruby-crowned kinglet was recorded yesterday in Santa Clara County. The first white-crowned sparrows about a week ago. They're just coming.
So maybe next month?
Yeah, all the way from November to March.
Okay.
So Shani, there were a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm not sure, I want to make sure we get those answered. So what steps are cities taking in the Bay Area to try to promote dark skies?
We've been advocating with cities, and we really use opportunity. So if there is somebody who we think is going to listen in the city council and lead a champion, then we'll work with them. So at this point, several cities have some protections from light in various regulation that applies to bird safety, and that would be Mountain View, Sunnyvale, mostly. There are some in mitigation measures, I think, and some in general plans. I think there's a little bit in Menlo Park and Santa Clara. Cities that actually by design are doing work on dark sky. Cupertino passed an ordinance, and and we're now working in Los Gatos. So Los Gatos has already put a few placeholders or new policies in their general plan update, and so we're working on that. Yeah.
Would you have an idea why lights out is more prevalent in the East Coast versus the West Coast?
I think that's because they have so many more tall buildings. We're just starting to get a lot of tall buildings, but they were seeing hundreds of birds on the ground in one evening because they have taller buildings. So if you look at bird collisions in general, most used to occur with single residence home because there are so many more of them. But now that in areas that have a lot of really tall buildings during migration, there is a problem. And so that's probably why. I think that we need to start working on that, but I would think, I think we need to start looking at Sunnyvale and San Jose, and some other cities that now have taller buildings. In San Francisco, they tried and failed. San Francisco is probably the worst city that we have in this region in terms of light. They don't have a night anymore at all. If you look at local news, which I monitor as part of advocacy, and you see the pictures that come from San Francisco, it's horrifying. San Jose is trying to go that way, but we fight them every step of the way, and we've been a little more successful than Golden Gate Audubon, I think.
So do you have an idea of what building height is too tall?
What do you mean too tall?
Well, as far as bird strikes, is there a building height that is always going to be problematic?
I don't know. I think it's the combination of where it is and light. If it's near a creek, yes, always, any building, any height. The taller it is, the worse, probably. People think that most of the collision occur at the height of the trees, but there is more and more evidence that during heavy migration nights, it happens at taller elevations.
Okay.
I think on day-to-day protections, you really want to kind of focus on the lower buildings, but during migration, taking a look at what's happening at the higher, taller buildings is important.
Okay.
I don't see that when there is no migration waves, that the taller buildings are all that dangerous, but during migration, they are, and light attracts birds to those locations. We're fighting a project in San Jose, and those of you who live there and have heard of that confluence light pollution tower. I'm sorry, this cat really wants attention. So they have a project called, what was the name of it? Dash?
It's Urban Confluence Silicon Valley. It's the name of this light tower.
No, that's the company. They have a name of that.
Oh, gosh, what is it called? Breeze of Innovation.
Yeah, Breeze of Innovation. It's a huge 200 feet tall light polluting thing. Can't even describe what it is. Anyway, pretty bad. I think there's more questions here, but I'm trying to find.
Yeah. We might have to get going into our breakout sessions for the night.
I
But
want to know how to become an advocate.
yeah,
I think that Dash are you going to have a presentation on that? Because I trained Dash and he can tell you.
Yeah, I actually had it one class ago, but always happy to answer questions and you can send questions and I'll send them to Shani too, especially if they're more complicated. I always defer to her. So yeah.
or we can do a different session on that. And other things, my email, let me put my email here. So now it's in the chat. You guys can get back to me if you have more questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, honey, for all your work too.
Thanks.
All right, so we're hearing people clap, although they're muted, so it would be thunderous otherwise. So we are going to go into breakout groups now. And so remember, this breakout group is going to be devoted to your 50 to 100 word statement about your concerns or issues that you think the proposed development in East Palo Alto raises. And so again, you're not expected to be an expert, and you're not expected to cover all the potential impacts, but just really what do you remember about what the information that you've seen, and what concerns do you have? So, and again, remember, you have the opportunity to send this to the City Council if you want to. And so remember, you're also trying to start a relationship with a City Council member. So keep that in mind. So we'll go ahead and do breakout rooms, probably about 15 minutes. And then we'll get back together again.
At the Water Board, which has the privilege of having the most fun name of all the regulatory agencies in the region. And I'm going to talk about how tidal wetlands and nature-based infrastructure support a clean, healthy bay. Okay, so first I really want to do a brief territory acknowledgement. I'm going to be discussing lands in the region that have been stolen from indigenous peoples, including the Ohlone, Miwok, and Patwin tribes. The colonization of these lands is ongoing for lots of reasons. One of them is that few of these tribes are federally recognized. So the Water Board derives its jurisdictional authority from a number of laws, including the Federal Clean Water Act, which was actually inspired by water pollution control legislation here in California, the Porter Cologne Water Quality Control Act, as well as basin plan policies in the San Francisco Bay Water Quality Control Plan, the Water Quality Control Plan for the San Francisco Bay Basin, which is basically our Bible. And this Bible has lots of chapters. Chapter 2 describes beneficial uses of San Francisco Bay, which are basically the functions and the services that are provided by a clean, healthy bay. Chapter 3 of this basin plan describes the water quality objectives. So these are qualitative and quantitative objectives to support those beneficial uses. And then chapter 4 of the basin plan describes implementation plans, which is how are we going to get there? How are we going to achieve those water quality objectives so that we can support those beneficial uses? And one of the great things about going at the end of a session with so many of my illustrious colleagues is that they've already covered half of this for me. So I'll try to get through this quickly so we can get through the Q&A. So what are some of the key activities that the Water Board regulates in the region? I once told a commissioner on BCDC that, well, sir, frankly, if it's wet, we regulate it. And that's kind of true. We regulate the placement of fill in wetlands and waters. We regulate the dredging and beneficial reuse of sediment. We regulate the discharge of treated wastewater from municipal facilities and industrial facilities, both nearshore and offshore. We manage stormwater, and we're also responsible for the cleanup of polluted sites, including nearshore groundwater sites. So what are some of the key beneficial uses that the Water Board is charged with protecting in the San Francisco Bay region and in the bay and its wetlands? So and these are actually like listed beneficial uses in the basin plan. So one of these is obviously estuarine habitats, the mud flats, the tidal marshes that we've been hearing about so much today, providing habitat for rare and native and special status species, and also supporting recreation, commercial fisheries, shellfish harvesting. These are all explicit beneficial uses of San Francisco Bay and its wetlands. And I really appreciate going right after Valerie. She spoke a lot about our rare and special status species, not just the Ridgway's rail and the salt marsh harvest mouse that you've heard about so much, but also fish such as Chinook salmon and rare plants such as salt marsh birdsbeak. I'm also one of the directors of the California Native Plant Society, so I'm contractually obligated to tell you that really in the edges of the bay, it's not just the rare plants that are important for conservation, but also rare tidal wetland ecotypes. So when we talk about, rare enlisted species, those are, species, very distinct populations, which we know we have, they're very small populations and they have very limited distribution. But the same is true of some common plant species that live in strange or unusual or rare places in the landscape. And there's actually a lot of those around the edges of San Francisco Bay. So for example, these are yellow-rayed goldfields. Many of you have probably seen goldfields up in our uplands and our grasslands. But where vernal pools and freshwater wetlands used to be adjacent to salt marshes or are adjacent to salt marshes, this is a rare ecotype. So I want folks to think about the importance of that landscape connectivity. I'm sure Letitia's going to talk a lot about that in the next session that the Sierra Club is hosting, but really think about landscape connectivity when it comes to these ecosystems. They provide protection from waves and floods. We've talked about how important it is to have tidal marshes and other nature-based infrastructure in front of our built communities to help protect them from waves and levee overtopping. And they really critically provide water quality improvement. And that's going to be the focus of my talk today. And going after Patty, she's such a phenomenal scientist. I really appreciate her talk and how she made it really clear about the carbon sequestration benefits of tidal marshes. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these other functions, particularly the biogeochemical processes that lead us to often talk about tidal marshes as the kidneys of the bay. I like to drink wine. I live up in wine country, so I also like to think of them perhaps as the liver of the bay. But it really cannot be overstated how critical wetlands are to water quality. And that's for lots of different reasons, but mostly because of this very unique biogeochemistry that wetlands have, where they have this coupling of aerobic and anaerobic, so soils with oxygen and soils without oxygen. And that coupling allows for a lot of very complex biogeochemical cycles that don't happen or that happen to a much reduced degree in terrestrial habitats. And so denitrification is a huge one, the removal of nitrogen and basically taking runoff, taking nitrogen from stormwater runoff and from wastewater and actually turning it into gaseous nitrogen. So actually getting it up out of the water column, getting it up out of the landscape and into that atmospheric reservoir. Now, we know that wetlands are really good at doing this, at doing denitrification, at removing other pollutants such as metals and other complex pollutants. And we've used that knowledge to develop treatment wetlands throughout the bay. And here, these are pictures of some polishing wetlands, one at the Las Galinas treatment plant in San Rafael, in Martinez at the Hayward Marsh, in Petaluma at the Ellis Creek facility. Wetlands are really, really good at removing lots of compounds that don't come out, that aren't removed through traditional wastewater and stormwater treatment processes. And again, it's those unique environmental conditions that make them particularly well suited to treating lots of very common pollutants in the bay. Now, the problem is that, as my colleagues have very well illustrated to you, is that we've pretty much eliminated almost all of the tidal wetlands around the edge of San Francisco Bay, between 80 and 90%, depending on how you account for centennial marshes. And so not only have we eliminated all of the most of the marshes around San Francisco Bay, but we've colonized our landscape such that we're releasing tremendous amounts of different types of pollutants. So we've got urbanization, agriculture, and tidal wetland reclamation has led to a polluted bay. And many common nutrients, including nutrients, metals, PCBs, dioxin, organics, emerging contaminants, microplastics. These are all an issue throughout almost the entire bay. And for that reason, or for many reasons, this water board is collaborating with numerous stakeholders in the region and has been for decades on a regional monitoring program. And we keep a very close eye on water and sediment in the bay, bivalve tissue to see what contaminants are bioaccumulating in the estuarine food web, sport fish tissue, cormorants and tern eggs to really understand how are these contaminants, what are the pathways, what are the sources, what are the loadings into the bay, and how are they integrating or not into the food web. So nutrients is a real big focus of the Water Board and our stakeholders right now. Some of you may have heard about eutrophication. Perhaps you've heard about this within the context of Mississippi River drainage basin and the loss of oxygen down at the mouth in the Gulf of Mexico. But it's basically a process whereby nutrient enrichment leads to algal blooms and die-offs, and that leads to the development of tremendously low dissolved oxygen that can kill aquatic life. Now, we've got an interesting situation here in San Francisco Bay where we are certainly nutrient enriched with how urbanized of an estuary we are. We have a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in the system, but we're not quite eutrophic yet. And that's likely due to a combination of factors that are really complex to tease out. And that includes tidal mixing, the fact that we have a shallow, very well mixed estuary that helps to support pretty robust dissolved oxygen concentrations, even at the bottom of the bay. We have light limitation from high turbidity. We have a lot of suspended sediment moving around in the estuary. That makes it hard for light to penetrate deep into the water column, which makes it harder for algal blooms to form. And we also have a lot of non-native clams and other bivalves that exert a lot of grazing pressure on the algae in the water column and help keep blooms from getting out of hand. However, there's preliminary evidence that climate change is really beginning to shift the baseline of primary productivity in the estuary. And this could have really important ramifications for the potential of the bay to become eutrophic in the future. And so this is something that the Water Board is really closely keeping an eye on. Another thing we're closely monitoring are emerging contaminants. And these are pollutants that, again, aren't treated very well in traditional wastewater treatment plants. And they're pollutants that we're only really beginning to understand the ramifications of their persistence in the environment. So this is complex. This includes complex organic compounds, things like pesticides and herbicides, but pharmaceuticals as well. And these are increasingly a big deal in our municipal wastewater streams. Drugs such as antibiotics, painkillers, contraception, complex molecules that just aren't broken down in traditional wastewater treatment plants. Now, we know that we've already lost most of the wetlands around the edge of the bay, and folks have already today, and I know you're going to hear more about this in the subsequent sessions, it's not looking great for the tidal marshes around the estuary in the future, particularly if we see a future where we have limited sediment supplies and very high rates of sea level rise. And you'll probably see this graphic again. This is work done by Lisa Sheely a couple years ago, showing that over time, a transition from robust, healthy high marsh, that bright green color, to low marsh, that light green color, and potentially mudflat, the brown color, if we don't have enough suspended sediment and high rates of sea level rise. So we have multiple challenges. We've got historic and potential future losses of tidal marshes, degraded water quality. We have natural and built communities that are vulnerable to flooding and erosion. We've lost habitat. And I really want to hammer this home. We've got limited green space for marginalized and minoritized urban communities, and including to support cultural use by tribes. So multiple challenges require multi-benefit solutions. And one example of these, you've heard it talked about a little bit so far today, is the horizontal levee. And so this is a graphic of a subsurface seepage levee where we're basically taking treated wastewater and using that treated wastewater, applying it to an ecotone slope and allowing that subsurface seepage of treated wastewater to go underneath subsurface through the levee slope, and basically recreating that natural freshwater saltwater gradient that used to exist throughout the edges of the bay. This approach has been tested at Orloma. It's currently being rolled out in a couple other locations at full-scale projects in the bay. And again, so it's recreating these fresh to salt marsh gradients that can help support not only our rare and native species, but again, also those rare ecotypes, those species that live at that ecotone between freshwater and saltwater marsh. Horizontal levees, the research that's been done so far at Oraloma has demonstrated that they're incredibly effective at removing nutrients and other pollutants, particularly when flow is limited to the subsurface and not to the surface. That leads to hydraulic short circuiting, and that really limits the treatment efficacy of these wetlands. But these are some graphs from a recent paper by a team at Cal and Stanford, including one of my former professors, David Sedlak, and showing just how effective the horizontal levee is at removing nitrate, trace organics, even viruses are very effectively removed by the horizontal levee. Horizontal levees can help reduce the ultimate size of flood risk management levees behind them, landward of them. Julie talked about this, a lot of the other speakers. And they provide accessible green space. And I want to hammer this home because for so many of our urban and marginalized minoritized communities, tidal wetlands along the edge of the bay are some of the most accessible green space. And if hopefully we've learned lots of things over the last year and a half, but I think one of the things that many of us have come to recognize is just how crucial open space and green space are to our mental and our physical health. And so it's really important, especially in our urban communities, that we have access to nature to support community health. And I had to, these are photos from a Bay Nature article about the Oraloma horizontal levee. I think this is a great photo of Jeremy, and please make sure that you see his talk. He's going to talk about Oraloma and a number of other nature-based approaches on May 27th. So just to let you know what the Water Board is doing to further support analysis of where horizontal levees may be appropriate throughout the estuary, we're supporting the San Francisco Estuary Institute to develop the next phase of the Adaptation Atlas. We were the primary funder for the first phase. We're continuing to fund it for subsequent phases. Phase 2 is taking a closer look at precisely where in the estuary we have kind of that confluence of geomorphically appropriate space along the shoreline and proximity to wastewater treatment plants that can help support horizontal levees throughout the region. And this is a very preliminary analysis. Frankly, it's a document that I have to review. It's on my desk, but I'm really grateful to SFEI for doing this work. Here's an example of the analysis that they're doing, showing in the Alameda and Maori OLUs where horizontal levees may be appropriate, and especially where they might be appropriate near wastewater treatment facilities. So in summary, the historic and potential future losses of tidal marshes around the bay really negatively impact lots of beneficial uses, but especially water quality, habitats, flood vulnerability, and cultural and recreational uses. And to solve these, to address these multiple challenges, we really need multiple benefit strategies, including, but certainly not limited to, horizontal levees. They're a great solution. They are not appropriate for everywhere in the bay. This came up a little bit in our previous discussion of Foster City, but in geomorphically appropriate regions of the bay, they could be a very excellent multi-benefit solution. And work is ongoing at the Water Board at SFEI with our partners and stakeholders, BACWA, Bay Area Clean Water Agencies, to figure out what is the optimal location and design of these systems throughout the region. So thanks to my many collaborators. And if you have any questions, we'll take them in the Q&A, but please don't hesitate to reach out to me individually. There's my email right there.
Thank you, Christina. Next, we'll have panel Q&A. So please make sure you send in your questions through the
Hey, Chip. It's Stephen Nemeth.
Yeah, hi.
That was so much information, and Christina talks so fast. I was having a hard time, and this is the second time I've been watching it.
Yeah.
And I was getting more information this time than I got the first time. So I'm just, you know, she really loaded us with a lot of information there. It was fascinating.
No, it is, but there's so much that relates to things we've been talking about too. It's worth going back and listening to it again, and it is available online. So